Royals, they're not like the rest of us. They're rich, they're powerful, and they're the reason behind those movie disclaimers on true stories. Really. King George III really wanted to be a good king, but there's two things you should know about him. He was king during the American Revolution, and they made a movie about him called The Madness of King George. Pretty accurate title there. In short, he was nuts. He rambled often, talking for hours on topics that interested him and basically nobody else. He also attempted to control the lives of his children, probably acting this way out of a misguided kind of love. George's boys managed to wriggle out of his grasp, but the girls lived profoundly claustrophobic lives bounded by their parents' anxieties. No one's really sure what the so-called madness really was: bipolar, arsenic poisoning, or porphyria, which is this rare red blood cell disease. Regardless, being crazy and being the king led to some interesting adventures. A brief mental collapse in 1788 was followed by a more permanent detachment from reality in 1811, and George died 9 miserable years later. Queen Christina of Sweden is an excellent example of strange, not necessarily meaning bad, but strange she was. She became queen at the age of 6 when her father was killed in the 30 Years' War. That left Christina as the nominal head of a huge kingdom embroiled in a complex war. That's a lot for a 6-year-old. Against the odds, Christina grew up to be something of a luminary. She knew at least 6 languages, and after coming into her full power as queen, she began the first newspaper in Sweden. She also corresponded with philosophers and participated in the Peace of Westphalia, which finally brought an end to the 30 Years' War. Now for the strange part. After a mere 10 years on the throne, she gave it all up. Christina handed the crown to her cousin, began dressing in men's clothes, and ambled south to visit Rome. There, the Lutheran ex-queen converted to Catholicism, which made the Pope happy. But then Christina decided she wasn't done being a queen after all, and asked if she could rule Naples. That was denied, but that's okay. There's plenty of other countries that could use a queen. She tried for the throne of Poland, which was also denied to her. In 1660, she returned to Sweden, and you'll never guess what she tried to do again. Yep, the queen stuff. She was denied again, not so much for her abdication earlier, but because she was now a Catholic, which was a no-no in the Lutheran country.
People are thought to think that the king is perfect in every way.
This must be a tough rule to follow for the Thai people too, because Vajiralongkorn, the king of Thailand, is something of an oddball. Bad things first. Vajiralongkorn has clamped down on the dissent within the kingdom, cycled rapidly through a number of wives and mistresses, and left the country without an obvious heir by stripping his children of their titles. Also, his name is really hard to say, so my bad to any of our Thailand viewers out there. Anyway, slightly more endearingly, Vajiralongkorn also really loves dogs. He once flew to Germany on a private jet accompanied by no fewer than 30 poodles. On another occasion, he promoted his beloved pet Fufu, most obvious name ever for that dog, to the rank of Air Chief Marshal of the Thai Air Force, and even had him appear at formal banquets. Fufu actually died back in 2015, prompting Vajiralongkorn to hold 4 days of Buddhist funerary rites in his honor. See? He really loves dogs. He also has a cool nickname, Rama X, which I wish I'd mentioned earlier so I didn't have to say his full name 3 times. Princess Margaret wasn't much like her well-behaved older sister. Unlike the late Queen Elizabeth II, Margaret smoked, drank, married unwisely, engaged in affairs, and there's even this Jason Statham movie that's about one of her most scandalous incidents, allegedly. Honestly, it's easy to like the idea of Princess Margaret, who was well known to be both witty and glamorous, but Margaret had her less pleasant qualities too. She was well aware that she was a princess, and she seemed to get a kick out of getting away with things, battering squirrels with her umbrellas, for example. She was also quite the hedonist. In some cases, she was known to glue matches to her drinking glasses so she didn't have to put down her drink to light a fresh cigarette. She also spent money wildly, and she was perfectly happy to be rude when she felt like it. So while she might be good for a laugh or two in short bursts, Margaret probably wasn't the kind of person you'd want to hang out with for an extended period of time. Over the years, Prussian has become a byword for a kind of straight-laced, militaristic propriety. Unfortunately, thanks to one wayward royal, the sexual proclivities of the Prussian upper crust used to give the term a different meaning. Princess Charlotte of Prussia loved gossip, which, while perhaps understandable, wasn't really considered behavior fitting of a princess. She didn't do herself any favors in 1891 either, when she invited a significant number of Prussian nobles to join her for a series of, how shall I say this? orgies at a hunting lodge outside Berlin. After one such orgy, many of the participants received explicit blackmail letters that demanded a heavy price to remain silent about all the fun they'd had. Several hints point to Charlotte as the architect of the blackmail scheme. For one, she had arranged the gatherings in the first place. The letters were also written in feminine handwriting and featured catty swipes at other female partygoers. On top of all that, Charlotte's diary somehow made its way to her brother, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Wilhelm read the diary and became so angry at its contents that he rescinded his sister's income and sent her husband to the eastern region of Breslau, far, far away from swinging Berlin. Prince Felix Yusupov must have been a lot of fun, if you could keep up with him. As a child, he used to dress in his mother's jewels and pretend to be the Ottoman Sultan. On many occasions, he claimed to be able to hear ghosts.
I see dead people.
As an adult, he inherited a colossal fortune and led a brief career as a drag artist. After that, he married Irene Alexandrovna, the Tsar's niece, and one of the most glamorous women at the Russian court. Yusupov was also one of the key figures in the 1916 plot to kill Rasputin. It's from his memoirs that we have the famous story of Rasputin gulping down poisoned wine and asking for more. Yusupov and his fellow conspirators did eventually kill Rasputin, though. For this, he was exiled to the very edge of Russia, which probably saved his life, as it meant that he and his wife were out of town when the Russian Revolution took place in 1917. Yusupov's next major contribution to history came in the 1930s, after the release of 1932 biopic titled Rasputin and the Empress. This Hollywood retelling of Rasputin's death featured a scene in which Rasputin sexually assaults a character clearly based on Yusupov's wife. Infuriated, Yusupov sued MGM. He was awarded substantial damages as a result, while MGM was forced to make changes to the film's edit. It's the reason why movies now include disclaimers that clarify the fictional nature of their stories. So now you know. Elizabeth Charlotte of the Palatinate is a figure whose eccentricities tend to charm rather than repel. In the vapid, frivolous court of Versailles, the woman known to her friends as Lisa Latta always remained just as she was. Plain-spoken, free of vanity, and very, very German. Lisa Latta was from the Palatinate, a German princely state in the Rhineland near France's eastern edge. An important fact, as the state's ruler helped elect the Holy Roman Emperor. This made Lisa Latta important enough to marry Louis XIV's brother, Philippe, Duke of Orleans. Philippe's main loves in life were men and gambling, which made him fun at parties, but a poor match for Lisa Latta. They did manage to produce 2 children through sheer determination. For her part, Lisa Latta hated the fussiness of the court and lampooned royal life in witty letters to friends and relatives back in Germany. She knew these were read by spies, too, and enjoyed describing embarrassing events like chamber pot mishaps to bother the king's agents. Elizabeth Charlotte held on to her Germanness, too. She always preferred German food, for example, and never lost her taste for beer. She hunted, rode horses, and loved a good fart joke. Not very ladylike by Versailles standards, but these traits quickly earned her the king's friendship.
Oh, sacre bleu!
Life at the court was never particularly easy for any outsider, but her wit and ingenuity left her a legacy as one of the few enduring figures from the court of the Sun King. Once an orphan with nothing to her name but her looks and luck, Irene of Athens caught the eye of Byzantine Emperor Constantine V, who married her to his heir Leo. After Leo IV died young, Irene ruled the empire in the name of their 9-year-old son, Constantine VI. Along the way, Irene considered marriage with Charlemagne. Yes, that Charlemagne. And changed the church's stance on veneration of images. So, to the Greek church, she's known as Saint Irene. But being a saint and being a saint are 2 different things. She spent much of her time in government sabotaging those she considered a threat to her power, including her son. Under her guidance, Constantine VI made himself immensely unpopular as ruler. He tore out the tongues of his rivals, suffered a series of military defeats, and left his wife for his mistress. Finally, when Constantine was good and friendless, Irene pounced. In 797, Constantine was deposed by his own mother. She had him blinded in the very room he'd been born in, no less. The blinding was an old Byzantine trick intended to make someone ineligible to rule without killing them, because who wants a blind king, right? But it didn't work this time. Not in the good way, like a comeback story. Constantine died. Irene ruled as emperor for 5 jittery years until she was overthrown by her own minister of finance. She died in exile a year later. Lest we judge Elagabalus too harshly, remember that he ruled Rome from the ages of 15 to 19, which isn't exactly the best time to find yourself at the head of an empire. He utterly failed in his role as emperor, of course, partly because of his own personal excesses, partly because the Romans were unnerved by his oddities, and mostly because, well, he was a teenager. Elagabalus came from a family of priests who were previously best known for leading the worship of a meteorite in Syria.
All hail the
the Metal Lord!
When the imperial throne became vacant, his ambitious grandmother marketed him as the illegitimate son of the Emperor Caracalla, a claim that was apparently considered good enough to get Elagabalus himself made emperor. Once in Rome, accounts describe a moody ruler who tried to reorient Roman religion toward his family's god Baal, as opposed to those pesky upstart Christians ruining everything, and who picked good-looking yet otherwise random people to run the government. Elagabalus took lovers of both sexes and even married a Vestal virgin, all the while presiding over extravagant banquets and killing just a few too many well-connected generals. This combination of sexual license and disregard for convention doomed his reign, and Elagabalus was assassinated in 222. In their last few decades in power, the Habsburgs of Austria-Hungary just kept taking it on the chin as a slew of scandals and tragedies rocked the imperial house. Perhaps the most shocking of these was the murder-suicide of Crown Prince Rudolf and his 17-year-old mistress Maria Vajiralongkorn in 1889. A bird fancier who was considered fairly liberal by the standards of the time, Rudolf felt stifled waiting for his father, Emperor Franz Joseph, to die. Meanwhile, Rudolf wasn't especially fond of his wife, Stephanie of Coburg, who was neither seen to be pretty, nor pleasant, nor prestigious. The royal family of Belgium wasn't as old or grand as the Habsburgs, so Rudolf used women to distract himself from these problems, including his fatal relationship with Vajira. The exact trigger for the act isn't known, but Rudolf and Vajira apparently decided to forge the pact together. The most likely story goes that Rudolf shot Vajira and then himself, though some people accuse Vajira of killing Rudolf with poison. Others claim that the incident hinged on a botched abortion, or put forth various other pet theories. Either way, with Rudolf dead and the emperor left without a son, Rudolf's cousin Franz Ferdinand became Austria's heir presumptive and future brand name. Of course, Ferdinand would never become emperor either. His assassination in 1914 was the spark that lit the flame of World War I. Give credit where credit is due. King Frederick William I of Prussia was an extremely competent administrator, repopulating areas that had been battered by plague and instituting financial reforms that made the kingdom solvent. His real baby was his army, though, which he built into a large and potent fighting force using a revamped system of recruitment. He also had a height fetish. Famously, Frederick William liked tall soldiers. He formed a special Prussian regiment of grenadiers, all above about 6 foot 2 inches in height, with taller men receiving more pay. These men might have been purchased from their parents as promisingly lanky children, transferred from other armies by leaders interested in pleasing the Prussian king, or simply abducted. Showing a somewhat lacking understanding of science, Frederick William also tried to stretch some of his men on a special rack, and paired others off with unusually tall women in hopes of creating super tall offspring.
Do you find something comical about my appearance?
Frederick William was also shockingly cruel to his son Frederick, who was artistic, cultured, gay, and worst of all, around 5 foot 3 inches. When Frederick's attempt to escape his father's abuse failed, the prince was forced to watch the execution of the friend who had tried to help him. Frederick had the last laugh, though. He turned out to be a much better king than his father and is now remembered as Frederick the Great, better than Frederick the 5'3". Queen Maria I of Portugal didn't have a particularly easy life as royal lives go. In 1755, when Maria was a young woman, Lisbon was smashed by an earthquake and tsunami that left much of the capital in ruins, including the principal residence of the royal family. Only an outing to the countryside saved them from the fate that many of their subjects suffered. A fundamentally kind woman, Maria was a gentle queen who reversed some of her father's harshest policies and enjoyed a positive reputation, both in Portugal and Brazil. Unfortunately, she had also inherited the mental health issues that plagued her mother's family. Her illness first manifested in melancholia and religious fervor, both of which were considered tolerable in a Catholic queen, but she began to deteriorate after experiencing a series of tragedies in her personal life. Unable to distinguish symptoms from sins, she insisted that she was already damned and began to suffer chaotic mood swings, which finally led her to hand over control of the government to her son. When Napoleon's armies menaced Lisbon, Maria joined the rest of her family in exile in Brazil. She was reportedly unable to understand why she was being put on a boat and suffered a nervous breakdown on the journey across the Atlantic. She died without ever returning home. Tsar Peter III had the misfortune to rule between the reigns of two far more competent monarchs, his aunt, Empress Elisabeth, and his wife, Catherine the Great. It was Catherine who bumped Peter off the throne when it became clear what a disaster he was shaping up to be, and as it turns out, Catherine had some pretty compelling arguments for doing so. Much of what we know about Peter comes from either Catherine's pen or those of her political allies, so you shouldn't necessarily believe everything you hear about him. That said, Peter managed to make one colossal mistake during his brief reign that alienated basically literally everyone who was paying attention. Before he took the throne, his aunt's government had been participating in the 7 Years' War as an ally of Austria and France. And while those powers weren't doing enormously well in the conflict, Russia was beating Prussia so badly that its king began to genuinely consider death by self-harm, as we put it today. Auntie Elizabeth died before the killing stroke fell, and Peter decided to make peace with Prussia pretty much right away. He had two reasons for doing this. Firstly, he actually liked Prussia. Secondly, he wanted to go to war with the Danes.
Keto, things are very fishy in Denmark.
To use a fitting idiom, Peter rode in on his horse, so to speak. No pun intended. You see, Russia's elites were so appalled by Peter's peace pact that they found themselves quite willing to replace him with Catherine. So Catherine took the throne, Peter died in prison, and Russia's armies never got to ravage Copenhagen. Caroline of Anspach had all you'd ever want in a queen. Both popular and intelligent, she was able to manage the affairs of her much less intelligent husband, George II. Caroline understood her husband so well, in fact, that she even found him mistresses who wouldn't cause more trouble than necessary. Outside the palace, she encouraged smallpox inoculation in Britain and distinguished herself as a patron of the arts. Caroline was even trusted to run the government while the king was away running his other possession, Hanover. It seemed as if this Enlightenment queen could bring nothing but joy and progress to the court in London. Yet Caroline had one fatal flaw. She absolutely despised her eldest son, as did her husband, who had himself been hated by his own father. In fairness, Prince Frederick was hardly an ideal prince, preferring to run around with a bad crowd and gamble rather than learn the ways of the monarchy. But since he'd been left to grow up alone in Hanover while his parents hopped over to London to take their crowns, it might be understandable that he didn't much care what they thought. Caroline and George brought Frederick's sisters to Britain before they sent for him too, and when he finally arrived, they literally brought him in through the back door. Oh, and they refused to give him an allowance, which probably didn't go down too well either. As time went on, the situation got so bad that Caroline tried to pass over Frederick and give the crown to his son, the future George III, which is crazy. Wow. Let me rephrase that. Which is highly uncommon. All the while, the royal couple attempted to micromanage the birth of Frederick's first son in 1737. The rift was still unhealed when Catherine died later that year. Few people have suffered more dramatic changes in fate than the man who, at the end of his life, was King Charles XIV, John of Sweden and Norway. At the beginning of his life, he had been Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, a lawyer's son from southwestern France. Bernadotte joined the French army as a young man and sided with the revolution when it arose, leading his troops through the wars that followed. He had a complicated relationship with Napoleon Bonaparte, but Charles's oath of allegiance after Napoleon declared himself emperor was enough to land him a job helping to run Germany for the French. Then, in 1810, someone asked Bernadotte if he would like to be king of Sweden. Sweden's king, Charles XIII, was childless and ill at the time, meaning the job would be open sooner rather than later. The Swedes had been impressed with Bernadotte's administration in Germany and civil treatment of Swedish POWs, and they figured it'd probably be wise to maintain a connection to France since Napoleon was dead set on rampaging across Europe.
300,000 souls live in the city, and they've all just left?
Bernadotte, a man who'd once written that he wanted to fight all royalists to the death, accepted, because irony rules. He excelled as king, too, steering Sweden calmly through the rest of the Napoleonic Wars and later winning control of Norway from the Kingdom of Denmark. Despite never really learning Swedish, he reigned more or less successfully until his death in 1844, and his descendants still sit on the throne of Sweden. Even relatively sympathetic accounts of Caroline of Brunswick read like insults. Caroline was to be the wife of the future George IV of the United Kingdom, but someone somewhere didn't carry out their due diligence on her. The only thing worse than her manners was her hygiene. On their first meeting, the Prince of Wales reportedly needed to fix a stiff drink. After the one recorded night together produced an error, the prince informed Caroline that her bedroom duties would no longer be required. So Caroline decided to amuse herself as she wished, which largely involved collecting erotic clockwork. Just use your imagination, and sleeping her way across Italy. When George III died in 1820 and the time came for George IV to be crowned, he actually tried to bribe her to stay out of Britain. And when she returned anyway, George attempted to exclude Caroline from the queenship she might reasonably expect to enjoy, what with her still being technically married to the king. After this, George tried to push a bill through Parliament that would allow him to divorce Caroline, but gave up when he realized it would fail. In the end, Caroline had to attempt to physically force her way into George's coronation. She failed and died 3 weeks later. Members of the Wittelsbach line of Bavarian royals often suffered mental health problems, so it's perhaps no surprise that when an exceptionally pretty princess from that family named Elisabeth was chosen to marry the young Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary, unhappiness soon followed. Despite the very real love both her husband and the Austro-Hungarian people bore for Elisabeth, she was rarely happy and died before her time in a senseless assassination. Elisabeth, known affectionately to many as Sisi, suffered an eating disorder, though this wasn't fully understood at the time. She retained a sub-20-inch waist into late middle age. She was also obsessed with the preservation of her own beauty, both on her actual face and in the public record. She allowed no photographs of her to be taken after she was 30. Intelligent and restless, she was bored senseless by the stuffy Habsburg court and escaped when she could to Hungary, which she liked much better. After the death of her son, Crown Prince Rudolf, Elisabeth lost what little ability she'd ever had to sit still. She moved to Greece, then back to Vienna, and she continued to travel after that, seemingly trying to outrun her own depression. Then, during a visit to Lake Geneva in 1898, an anarchist stabbed Empress Elisabeth in the chest. His intended target, a French princeling, had changed his plans, but the assassin decided an empress would do. Sisi was so surprised by the attack that she didn't immediately realize she had been injured. She walked about 100 yards onto a ferry bound for France, then collapsed and died.
They always said he was very forthcoming and everything. He's a very bright student, and they thought he'll make a very good king.
Crown Prince Dipendra of Nepal once had everything a person might ever want: wealth, privilege, and a future as the king of a beautiful Himalayan country. We'll never know how his reign might have turned out, though, because in 2001, he got drunk and shot 8 members of his family to death. Or at least that's how the official story goes. During a private family gathering, Dipendra reportedly smoked drugs and drank whiskey before making a series of incoherent calls to his girlfriend. After that, he dressed himself in military fatigues and armed himself. He then proceeded through the palace in Kathmandu and shot his way through the billiard room and garden, killing his parents, siblings, and a number of other relatives before turning the gun on himself. That said, the official account of the massacre is doubted by many Nepalese people, who point out that the king's brother, Janendra, was conveniently absent from the party that night. After a dark and strange period in which the comatose Dipendra was technically still king, Janendra stepped up and took the throne. He was deposed in 2008, bringing a final end to Nepal's monarchy.